Rancher, you can't choose just one. By ancient law, you must marry all sisters. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Elias Walker rode east into the settlement with the same intention he carried every trip: gather supplies, speak to no one longer than he had to, and turn back before the sky lost its light. His homestead lay 8 miles out along the dry flats, a cabin rebuilt after flames had taken the first one, leaving only blackened timbers and a grave on the rise behind it. He was 36 now, wiry from years of labor, the sort of lean that comes from soil that gives little and nights that never feel long enough. Scars, some earned in war, others from the ranch, traced his skin like maps of places he'd rather not revisit. He did not love towns. Too many eyes, too much idle talk. But nails did not grow from earth, and lamp oil did not flow from wells, and salt was a thing the plains could not give. So he rode with a list in his mind: nails, flour, a tin of coffee if the price wasn't too steep. By noon the square lay ahead, wavering in the heat like a mirage.
Elias slowed his mare, expecting the ordinary sights. Wagons parked uneven along the street, horses tied to the rails, men leaning out of the saloon door with sweat rolling from under their hats. For a moment it was exactly that. Then came the sound. Not the regular Saturday stir of voices and hooves, but something sharper, meaner, carrying a note that made the hair rise on his neck. He reined in, scanning past the milling crowd. At the far edge of the square stood a freight wagon with its side gate dropped. 3 young women were bound against the rail, wrists tied cruel and high. Dust streaked their faces, dresses torn from struggle or handling. A hand-painted sign leaned against the wheel, letters jagged and fresh: "Forfeit by law, debt claimed." The air shifted around Elias, heavy and close. He swung down from the saddle, boots sinking in the packed dirt. Men stood in a half-circle watching, their voices low, half mocking, half hungry. The sheriff lingered nearby with his thumbs hooked in his belt, not lifting a hand to change what stood plain before him. One of the onlookers muttered, "Gambler lost him in a game. Old rule says the debt stands." Elias said nothing. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the girls. The eldest held her chin high, defiance flickering even as the rope bit into her skin. The second stayed close, steadying the youngest, who looked barely 16, barefoot and trembling, eyes darting like a cornered fawn. A verse Elias had learned long ago stirred in him, though he hadn't spoken it in years. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Psalm 82:3. He did not much care for crowds, nor for laws that served cruelty. But there are moments a man cannot ride past, and this, Elias knew, was one of them. Elias stepped forward until the circle of men parted just enough for him to see the sheriff's eyes. "Price?" Elias asked, his voice flat. The sheriff squinted, as though weighing whether this stranger meant to argue or just see it through. $30 for the lot. The number hung heavy. It was more than Elias had planned to spend this month, near half of what he carried. But his hand went to the coins in his pocket all the same. One by one, he set them down on the wagon's sideboard. Each struck the wood with a hard ring that cut across the square. Men shifted, muttering, some amused, some sour. When the last coin lay still, Elias stepped to the eldest girl. She flinched when his fingers brushed hers, but she did not pull back as he untied the nuts. Her wrists were raw, rope burns red against her skin. He moved on to the second, who met his gaze once, searching, before letting him cut her free. The youngest nearly fell forward when the rope loosened. Elias caught her under the arm, steadying her until she found her footing. No one spoke as he led them past the circle. The crowd opened, uneasy at the sight of something settled that should have been left unsettled. Elias lifted the youngest onto his mule, then helped the middle sister climb behind her.
The eldest stayed on the ground, chin high, eyes locked on him. "What's your name?" she asked, voice roughened by dust and sun. "Elias Walker." She gave a single nod, as if measuring the answer against her own judgment, then placed her hand in his. He pulled her up behind him, her grip steady on the saddle's back as they turned west. The town's noise thinned behind them, replaced by the creak of leather and the dull rhythm of hooves. Elias kept his eyes forward, the road long and dry beneath the fading sun. He thought of the work waiting back at the ranch, fences needin' mendem, cattle to check, but the thought carried new weight now. 3 strangers rode with him, strangers who had no say in what the law had made of them, and now they were his responsibility. Behind him, he felt the eldest's breath, not shallow but taut with fear she refused to show. The middle sister held tight to the mule's reins, one hand always resting on her youngest's knee. The girl leaned against her, half asleep from exhaustion, swaying with the mule's gait. By the time they reached the flats, shadows stretched long over the scrub. The cabin came into view, 1 room, a lean-to tacked against the side, smokehouse leaning tired but standing, a small corral gate propped with a rail. Beyond, on the rise, a weathered cross marked the grave that had kept Elias company for years. He swung down first, then helped the sisters dismount. "You'll sleep in the lean-to tonight," he said, pointing to the small space where he stored feed and tools. "It's dry."
"I'll clear room." The women said nothing, only watched as he carried out sacks of grain and set them under the eaves. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and iron. He stoked the stove, set beans to warm, and placed bread on the table. It wasn't much, but it was a roof, and it was safe. For the first time since he'd seen them bound on that wagon, Elias let out a slow breath. They were out of the square. Whatever came next, it would begin here. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The lean-to smelled of grain and dry wood. Elias had cleared it as best he could, stacking sacks beneath the eaves and sweeping the floor with a stiff broom. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and after what they had endured in the square, he knew 4 walls and a latch would feel like a fortress. He spread 3 blankets across the planks, then stepped aside without a word. The eldest, Clara, lingered in the doorway a moment, eyes scanning the corners as if searching for hidden threats. Only after she was satisfied did she nod her sisters inside. Ruth, the middle one, moved quickly to settle Lydia, who trembled as though the day's heat had frozen into her bones. Clara closed the lean-to door with a firmness that sounded almost like defiance. Elias banked the fire in the stove, letting the crackle fill the silence. He ladled beans into tin bowls, set bread beside them, and poured coffee dark and strong. They ate with little sound beyond spoons scraping metal. Clara's gaze flicked toward him more than once, sharp and appraising. Ruth kept her focus on Lydia, coaxing her to eat. The girl nibbled, eyes wide, as if afraid the food might vanish. When the meal was done, Clara stacked the bowls without being asked. Her hands were steady, but Elias caught the faint tremor in her jaw, the strain of someone carrying more than her share. He poured hot water into the basin, handed her the dishcloth, and stepped back. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and she pulled away as if burned. Neither spoke. Night settled heavy outside. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying scents of dust and far-off mesquite. Elias checked the corral one last time, then stretched out on his bed with his rifle leaned against the wall. Across the thin partition, he could hear the sisters shifting, whispering low. "I don't want them to come back," Lydia's small voice carried through the cracks. "They won't tonight," Ruth murmured, "not while he's here." Clara said nothing, but Elias imagined her lying awake, jaw tight, eyes open in the dark, just as his often were. Sleep came slow. He stared at the ceiling beams, the flicker of firelight painting shadows. Old memories crept in, the smoke of battle, the cry of men, the keening silence after the fire that had taken his wife.
He pressed a hand to the scar along his ribs, as if the old wound might answer back. At dawn, the air carried the bite of coolness. Elias rose early, raked the coals into flame, and stepped outside. The ground was damp with dew, his boots leaving dark prints as he walked the fence line. No tracks near the gate, no sign of riders. The unease in his chest eased a notch. By the time he returned, the sisters were stirring. Clara emerged first, hair pulled back, posture squared as if prepared for orders. Ruth knelt beside Lydia, brushing the girl's tangled hair with patient strokes. Elias poured coffee, set bread and beans on the table.
"There's a pump outside," he said. "Fill the barrel halfway. 2 trips should do it." Clara's eyes met his, cautious, guarded, but she gave a single nod. Together, the sisters stepped onto the porch. The creak of the pump handle and the splash of water into the barrel followed. For the first time since they'd come, the sound belonged not to fear, but to the rhythm of a house alive. Morning came with sunlight spilling through the cracks in the shutters. Elias had already been outside, checking the corral and feeding the mare. When he came back in, he found Clara sweeping the cabin floor with slow, deliberate strokes, her back straight, movements sharp as if every push of the broom was a declaration. "You gonna stand there all day?" she asked without looking up, catching him watching from the doorway. Elias grunted once. "Just making sure you're not putting the dirt under the bed." A flicker tugged at her mouth, almost a smile, before she went back to sweeping. It was the first crack in the armor she wore so tightly. Outside, Ruth carried a tin pail toward the coop. Chickens scattered at her feet, flapping and clucking in protest.
She flinched once, but then squared her shoulders and kept walking. With careful hands she scattered the feed, standing her ground as the birds swarmed. Lydia clung close, laughing when a hen pecked at her boot. The sound was thin at first, like she wasn't sure laughter belonged here, but it grew until it filled the yard with something light. Elias watched from the porch, arms crossed, saying nothing. But inside, he noted how different the place sounded now. He set them to chores one at a time, testing what they could handle. Ruth hauled water from the pump, her sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed pink with effort. Lydia followed her back and forth, spilling some, but determined, proud when she managed to keep the bucket half full. Clara moved on to stacking wood by the porch, hefting logs with practiced strength. Elias had expected her to falter, but she lifted without complaint, jaw set, eyes fixed straight ahead. By noon, the cabin bore the signs of women's hands, floor swept, blankets shaken out, dishes washed and set neatly on the shelf. Elias wasn't sure when the place had last looked so ordered. He busied himself mending a broken strap in the barn, but his ears picked up the quiet hum of Ruth's voice drifting from the lean-to, some old tune she must have carried from childhood. Lydia joined in, soft, off-key, but it was music nonetheless. Clara didn't sing. She stacked wood until her palms went red, then wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Catching Elias's eye, she tilted her chin slightly, daring him to tell her she was doing it wrong. He didn't. Instead, he said, "Stack square. Good work." For a heartbeat she froze, as though she hadn't expected acknowledgement. Then she turned away, muttering, "It'll hold through winter." But her shoulders eased as she bent for the next log. By late afternoon, the sisters sat on the porch steps, dresses dusted, hair loosened by the wind. Elias leaned against the rail, watching the horizon where the sun burned low. He still didn't know what place these women would carve in his life, or how long they meant to stay. But already the silence of the homestead had changed. It no longer pressed heavy. It carried voices, footsteps, the hum of work done together. For the first time in years, the place felt less like a man's lonely refuge and more like the beginning of something that could last. The south fence had split in the last storm. Elias had meant to set it right before the herd pressed against it, but other work had kept it waiting. Now, with Clara standing beside him, boots planted in the dust, the moment seemed right. "Hold this post straight," he said, showing her where to brace it. She set her hands on the rough cedar, muscles in her forearms taut.
Elias swung the hammer, the ring of metal echoing across the empty land. Each strike sent small vibrations through the post into Clara's grip, but she didn't flinch. When the rail sat square, Elias stepped back, wiped sweat from his brow, and gave a single nod. Good hold. 2 words, plain and flat, but they landed heavier than she expected. Clara's mouth twitched, as if she might smile. Then she set her jaw and moved to the next post without waiting for him. Back at the cabin, Ruth sat by the window with needle and thread. She had found one of Elias's shirts in a trunk, worn thin at the sleeve, seams fraying. Her stitches were neat, tight, patient. Elias paused in the doorway, watching the thread flash in the light. When she tied the last knot and smoothed the fabric flat, she glanced at him, waiting. He picked the shirt up, ran his thumb along the seam. Strong work. Ruth's eyes softened, relief plain. She smiled, small, quiet, but proud. It was the sort of smile that came from being seen. Meanwhile, Lydia had made herself queen of the chicken yard. She crouched low, peering under straw and boards. "Found one!" she cried, lifting an egg in her small hands as though it were treasure. She carried it back carefully, her grin stretching wide. "2 more!" she shouted minutes later, breathless with triumph. The sound made Elias chuckle under his breath, something he hadn't done in years. He crouched beside her once, showing how to check the nest without cracking the shell. She nodded solemnly, as though he'd passed down a secret worth guarding. By evening, the cabin bore traces of their labor. A shirt mended, eggs gathered, a fence line squared. Small things, but they shifted the air. Where silence had once pressed down, now there was movement, voices, the rhythm of life being rebuilt plank by plank. Elias stirred beans on the stove, the scent of salt pork filling the room. Ruth set plates without being told. Lydia hummed a tune she half remembered, something from church maybe, soft and sweet. Clara stayed near the door, gaze fixed outward, but her hand rested lightly on the back of a chair, grounded, less ready to bolt. They ate together at the table, no speeches, no grand thanks. Only the scrape of spoons and the steady warmth of food shared. But for the first time since he had brought them from the square, Elias felt the house was no longer just a shelter from wind and rain. It was beginning to sound, and even feel, like a home. Night had fallen cool, the kind that carried the scent of sage across the flats. Elias lit the lamp and set it on the table. The sister sat nearby, shoulders wrapped in borrowed shawls. Ruth mended a tear in Lydia's hem. Clara remained upright in her chair, watchful as always, her eyes moving around the cabin as if mapping each corner for weakness. On the shelf above the hearth lay a book, its leather cover cracked, edges worn from years of hands that had once turned its pages with care. Lydia's gaze lingered on it first. "Is that a Bible?" she asked softly. Elias looked over. His jaw tightened. "Was my wife's." The words hung heavy. Silence settled again until Clara stood, crossing to the shelf. She brushed dust from the cover, lifted it gently, as though afraid it might crumble. For a long moment she only held it, eyes lowered. Then she opened it, the pages yellowed and thin. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Psalm 23:1, spoken plain into the room. The sound seemed to settle Lydia, who leaned against Ruth, eyes closing, as though the words wrapped her like a quilt. Ruth mouthed the lines quietly, lips moving in rhythm with her sister's voice. Elias sat still, his hands clasped tight on the table. He had not heard that verse aloud since before the fire. It pulled memories he had buried. His wife reading by lamplight, the softness in her voice, the way she had believed those words, even in the hardest winters. He felt the ache in his chest sharpen, but with it came a strange easing, like a long-forgotten song remembered on the wind. Clara closed the book, holding it against her palms as though weighing its worth. Her eyes lifted to meet his.
For once there was no challenge in them, no sharp edge, only a quiet strength, as if the words had steadied her too. "You should keep it close," she said. "It belongs in use, not gathering dust." Elias nodded once, unable to answer more. Later, when the fire had burned low and the sisters had gone to the lean-to, Elias remained at the table. He opened the Bible himself, fingers tracing a margin note in faded ink. His wife's hand, written years ago. "He restores my soul." He closed it gently, setting it back on the shelf. Outside, the night stretched vast and silent. Stars spread wide across the Texas sky. For the first time in a long while, Elias let himself breathe deep, the weight of scripture and memory mingling with the air. It wasn't peace, not fully, but it was something close. And it stirred in him the thought that maybe the Lord's providence hadn't abandoned this lonely homestead after all. By the week's end, the cabin no longer carried the stillness of a house lived in by one man. Work still filled every day, water to be hauled, wood to be split, fences to mend, but the air inside had changed. It wasn't just Elias's boots on the porch anymore.
There were lighter steps, softer voices, the creak of floorboards under more than his own weight. Ruth had taken to sweeping the porch each morning, a habit no one asked of her. She hummed as she worked, a tune Elias recognized from church, though the words escaped him. Lydia joined in at times, her voice light and sweet, wobbling off-key but filling the yard with something that made even the hens seem calmer. Inside, Clara stirred beans at the stove, sleeves rolled, her movements precise. She didn't hum, she didn't smile, but there was a steadiness in her rhythm, the way she measured salt without asking, as though she'd decided this meal was hers to tend. Elias sat at the table oiling his rifle, watching the scene without speaking. For years the cabin had known only the scrape of his chair and the hiss of the fire. Now it held voices, the low murmur of sisters speaking to one another, the sound of a pot lid rattling, laughter muffled through the door. When supper came, they sat together without the same spiffness of the first nights. Ruth passed bread down the table. Lydia chattered about a hawk circling the creek bed. "Keeps the rats down," Elias said, and the girl grinned as if he'd told her something profound. Clara ate quiet, but her shoulders had lost some of their iron tension. Later, as dishes clattered in the basin, Ruth washed while Clara dried. Lydia perched on a stool humming. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not offering to help but not leaving either. He noticed how natural they looked in that small space, as though the cabin had always been meant for more than one. That night, when the fire burned low, Elias stepped outside. The stars blazed clear above the dark line of the ridge. He listened to the faint rise and fall of the sisters' voices from the lean-to, their laughter carrying like a fragile thread against the night wind. He remembered evenings past when silence pressed heavy after his wife's death, when the only sound was his own breath and the groan of timbers in the wind. Now, though he still felt the old weight in his chest, the house did not echo the same. It held warmth, not only from the fire, but from the presence of those who moved within its walls. Elias stood a long while on the porch, the rough rail under his hand. He did not call it family yet. He did not let the thought take root so quickly. But in the quiet of that night, he knew the cabin had ceased to be only a refuge. It was becoming, piece by piece, a home. The folded paper still lay on the table where Elias had dropped it days ago. Its words were crude, painted rough, but their weight lingered like a stain. Forfeit by law. As if people could be tallied beside cattle or grain. He had tried to ignore it, focusing on the work of each day. The fence rails, the firewood, the steady rhythm that filled the cabin now. But whenever he passed the table, his eyes caught on the paper. The edges curled slightly in the heat of the stove, but it remained, daring him to leave it unanswered. One evening, after the sisters had gone to the lean-to, Elias stepped outside. The wind carried a bite, cold rolling off the rise. He climbed it slowly, boots crunching against the dry grass, until he stood before the grave marker, weathered by years of sun.
The cross was plain cedar. The letters of his wife's name faded but still clear. He stood there with his hat in his hands, head bowed. "I never asked for this," he murmured, "but they're here now."
And leaving them to that wagon, I reckon it would have been a sin. He thought of Clara's steady hands on the fence post, Ruth's quiet pride in her stitches, Lydia's laughter over eggs. He thought of the psalm Clara had read aloud, "The Lord is my shepherd." Perhaps, he wondered, this was no accident. Perhaps Providence had steered his path to that square on that day. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hymn singing from the cabin. He lifted his head. For the first time in years, he let the thought take shape, that the Lord had not abandoned this place, even if Elias had long felt abandoned. The next morning, he hitched the mule to the wagon. The sisters stepped onto the porch, questions plain in their eyes. Clara was the one who spoke. "Where are you going?" Elias tightened a strap, his movements steady. "Back to town. That paper's not worth the ink on it, but if we leave it lying, trouble will find its way here." "You mean to fight them?" Clara asked. He shook his head. "I mean to put it to rest proper. Judge's word carries weight, and I won't have anyone say you belong to debt or game." Ruth stood behind Clara, her hand on Lydia's shoulder.
The younger girl's eyes were wide, lips pressed tight. Clara's gaze stayed locked on Elias, sharp as ever, searching for the truth behind his words. Finally, she gave a single nod. "Then we'll ride with you." Elias hesitated, then inclined his head. He had not planned for company, but something in her tone left no room for refusal. As they climbed into the wagon, Elias felt the weight in his chest shift, not lighter, but steadier. He no longer acted from duty alone. This was choice, conviction. The reins settled firm in his hands as he spoke, almost to himself. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. The mule started forward, hooves striking dust. Whatever waited in town, Elias was ready to face it, not as a man alone, but as one led by Providence. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The wagon wheels groaned as Elias guided the mule into town. The sisters sat close on the bench, dresses plain but mended, their hair tied back neatly. Clara's shoulders were squared, Ruth's hands folded tight in her lap, Lydia's eyes darting to every sound on the street. Men stopped their talk as the wagon rolled past. Hats tilted back, eyes narrowed. A few smirked, others spat in the dust, but none stepped forward. Elias kept his jaw set, eyes fixed on the clerk's office at the far end of the square. The bell above the door gave a sharp ring when he pushed it open. The clerk looked up from his ledger, brows lifting. "Didn't expect to see you so soon, Walker." Elias laid the folded paper on the counter. "Need this voided." The clerk frowned, reading the words scrawled in black paint. "Law says—" "Law says nothing about selling people," Elias cut in, his voice steady. "That paper was written to stop something worse. That's done now." The clerk hesitated, then slipped into the back room. Moments later, the judge himself stepped out, tall and lined with years. He read the paper slowly, then looked to the sisters standing behind Elias. Ruth lowered her eyes. Lydia clung to Clara's arm. Clara met the judge's gaze head-on. "These girls are free," the judge said at last, signing with a firm stroke. "And if there's a man in this county who claims otherwise, he'll answer in my court," he wrote again, placing a second paper before Elias. "The 2 younger are under your protection until they come of age. The eldest," his eyes lifted to Clara, "you are grown. You can go where you will." Silence stretched. The room seemed to hold its breath. Clara looked at the judge, then at Elias. His face was carved from stone, offering neither command nor plea.
"I'm not leaving," she said. Her voice was clear, firm, carrying more weight than the ink on the page. The judge's pen paused, then moved again. "So be it." He signed the last line. When they stepped back into the square, the air shifted. The same men still lingered, leaning on rails, watching. A murmur ran through them, low and sour. One man spat and said, "Ancient law says a man can't keep all three, marriage or return." Elias stopped, turning just enough for his voice to carry. "No law says I can't, and no man here owns them. They choose here." The words hung heavy, carried across the dust and heat. The muttering faltered. Eyes turned away. Even those who disagreed found no ground to stand on.
Clara climbed into the wagon without needing his hand. Her chin was high, her grip steady. Ruth followed, guiding Lydia up beside her. Elias took the reins again, steering them toward the road west. Behind them, the square buzzed with whispers, but none dared follow. Before them lay the open land, the sky wide, the road stretching back toward the cabin. For the first time, freedom was not a fragile hope, but a fact set down in ink. The road west was quiet on the return. The mule kept a steady pace, the wheels creaking over ruts, the sisters silent beside Elias. Each of them carried the weight of what had been settled in town, yet none spoke of it. Only Clara looked ahead, her chin high, as if she had finally planted her feet on ground no one could move her from. When they reached the cabin, the air inside felt different. The fire in the stove had gone low, but the place carried a warmth not from flame alone. The folded paper, signed by the judge, was tucked into Elias's pocket, and its weight felt heavier than any rifle he had carried. That evening they worked as though nothing had changed, yet everything had. Ruth took to sweeping the floor without waiting for instruction.
Lydia gathered eggs with a little laugh when a hen nipped at her boots. Clara stirred beans in the pot, moving with quiet assurance, as though the cabin had become hers to tend as much as his. Elias watched them from the doorway, arms folded. The sight stirred something he had not felt in years. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was more than survival. The house no longer echoed like a hollow shell, it carried life. Still, he could not shake the tension in his shoulders. He knew the kind of men who muttered in the square. Paper or no paper, they hated to lose. They would not forget. He had seen it before, in war and in cards, how men carried grudges like loaded pistols. That night, after the sisters settled in the lean-to, Elias stepped outside. The stars stretched sharp and cold above the ridge. He walked the fence line slow, boots crunching over the frost-hardened earth, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The corral was quiet, the mule chewing steady, the chickens huddled in their coop. Still, his hand never strayed far from the rifle at his side. Inside, Clara had not yet slept. She sat by the fire, knees drawn close, watching the flames as if searching for an answer.
When Elias came in, she looked up, her face lit by the glow. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked. Elias set his hat on the peg and banked the fire. His voice was calm, even though his jaw tightened. "Maybe, but this is settled by law now." Clara studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against her own instinct. Then she gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of acceptance. The cabin went quiet, the only sound the hiss of the fire. Ruth and Lydia's breathing came soft from behind the lean-to door. Elias stretched out on his bed, but sleep did not come easy. His mind kept circling back to the men in the square, to the bitterness in their voices. The judge's paper had given them ground to stand on, but Elias knew paper could burn, and men who felt cheated would look for fire. The morning broke clear, the first light catching on the frost that silvered the corral rails. Elias was mending a split rail when he saw the dust moving on the road. It wasn't the lazy drift of a passing traveler.
This was deliberate, 3 riders abreast, the sun glinting on the iron of their spurs. His jaw tightened. He wiped his palms on his shirt and called toward the cabin, his voice even but firm. "Inside! Bar the door!" The sisters appeared on the porch. Clara froze at the sight of the riders, her face going still. She didn't argue. She pulled Ruth and Lydia inside, dropped the bar across the door, and stood by the shuttered window. Lydia clutched her arm, whispering, "They're coming back." Clara put a hand over her sister's knuckles, steadying the tremor without a word. By the time the riders reached the yard, Elias was already standing in front of the porch. His boots were planted wide. His rifle leaned against the wall within reach, but not in his hands. He waited, the cold air biting through his shirt, his face unreadable. The lead rider was a man Elias remembered from the square, one who had jeered loudest when the paper was nailed to the wagon. His grin was sharper now, his hat pushed back, 2 companions flanking him like wolves. "We came to settle this proper," the man called. "Already settled," Elias replied, voice level. "Paper don't mean much out here if no one's willing to back it." The man spat in the dirt, edging his horse forward. "I'll back it," Elias said, not moving. The rider's grin widened. "You think you can keep 3 you bought off a wagon? Ancient law says you marry or give 'em back." Behind the shutter, Clara held her breath, fingers white on the wood. Ruth pressed close, shielding Lydia. They could hear every word, each one driving cold into their bones. Elias's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed steady. "Judge says they're free. They stayed because they choose to." One of the other riders barked a laugh, harsh and ugly. "Women don't get to choose, not out here." Elias's hand twitched toward the rifle, but he didn't take it yet. "They do here." For a moment, silence pressed heavy on the yard. The only sound was the creak of leather, the snort of a restless horse. The men shifted in their saddles, weighing the ground between them and the man who stood alone before the cabin. Inside, Clara's heart pounded. She could see him through the narrow crack in the shutters, tall and unyielding. He hadn't raised the rifle. He hadn't stepped back either. Whatever happened next would decide everything. The riders weren't smiling anymore. The yard was still a stone, the morning air sharp enough to cut. Elias stood with his hands loose at his sides, his rifle only a step away, but he did not move. The 3 riders waited, their horses stamping restless. Their leader's grin turned brittle. "You really think one man can stand against law and custom?" the rider sneered. "A scrap of paper don't change the old ways." Elias's voice carried steady across the frost. "Old ways don't bind me or them." The rider's grin faltered. He leaned forward in the saddle, his tone lowering. "Then maybe we take what's owed ourselves." Behind the shutters, Clara pressed closer to the crack, her breath shallow. She could see Elias's shoulders squared, his stance unshaken. He hadn't raised the rifle, not yet, but the space between words felt as taut as a drawn rope. One of the companions shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the butt of his pistol. Elias didn't flinch. His eyes fixed on the leader, unblinking. Then came the sound, hoofbeats rolling fast from the road behind. Dust rose, breaking the stillness. All 3 riders turned their heads. Sheriff Carver rode hard into the yard, 2 deputies at his side. He reined up sharp, dust swirling around his horse's legs. "Enough," the sheriff said, his voice cutting through the air. He pulled a folded paper from his belt and held it high. "Judge signed these. Any man trying to claim those girls now does it against the court." The yard hung in silence. The lead rider's jaw worked, eyes flicking from the sheriff to Elias. His hand tightened on the reins. His companions shifted, uneasy. Elias still hadn't touched the rifle. He only spoke once, calm and final. "It's over." The rider spat hard into the dirt. His grin was gone now, replaced by something darker. But he jerked his reins all the same. "This ain't over," he muttered. "Yes, it is," Elias answered flatly. For a long heartbeat, the threat hung in the air. Then the horses turned, hooves pounding as the three men rode out, their silhouettes shrinking against the pale ridge. Sheriff Carver dismounted, dust clinging to his boots. He handed the folded paper down to Elias. "Keep this where you can show it. Word'll spread." Elias nodded once, tucking the document inside his coat. His voice was quiet. "Appreciate it." The sheriff tipped his hat toward the cabin. Through the doorframe, Clara now stood, pale but steady, her eyes fixed on Elias.
When the riders were no more than specks on the horizon, Elias leaned the rifle back against the wall and let out a slow breath he'd been holding since dawn. The cabin behind him held silence, not of fear, but of relief. The dust of the riders still lingered when the yard grew quiet again. Elias leaned against the porch rail, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what had just passed. The rifle sat where it always did, untouched. Inside, Ruth and Lydia emerged first, hesitant, their faces pale but relieved. Clara lingered in the doorway, her eyes fixed on him. For a long moment she said nothing, only studied the man who had stood unarmed before three enemies. At last she stepped down onto the porch, boots striking the wood with quiet certainty. She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. "You didn't fire," she said softly. Elias's gaze lifted to meet hers. His answer was simple, steady. "Didn't have to." Her brow furrowed, as though she wanted to press him, to understand why. But something in his tone silenced the question. She looked away, her eyes glistening in the slant of afternoon light. Ruth guided Lydia back toward the cabin, whispering comfort as they went.
Clara remained where she was. The silence stretched, not tense now, but searching. Elias broke it first, his voice low, more like a confession than a statement. "I've seen enough killing. War taught me that." His jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping the ridge where the riders had vanished. Sometimes strength ain't in the trigger. Sometimes it's in standing. Clara's breath caught, a tremor moving through her. The verse her mother used to read at night returned to her mind, unbidden. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good," Romans 12:21. She had never thought it could live itself out in the dust of a frontier yard, yet here it was, in the man before her. She looked back at him then, truly looked, and for the first time her guardedness eased. Her shoulders lowered, her jaw softened. The iron will that had carried her this far did not disappear, but it bent, allowing room for something else. "You could have shot them," she whispered. "I could have," Elias agreed. "But then it would have been just another blood feud, one more grave on the rise. The Lord gave us another way today." The words settled heavy between them, not as doctrine, but as lived truth.
Clara felt them in her chest, where fear had once held tight. For a moment, neither moved. The wind stirred the cottonwood near the creek, its leaves whispering in the stillness. Then Clara gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of surrender, not of herself, but of her mistrust. "I see you now," she said quietly. Elias didn't ask what she meant. He only gave a single nod in return, his expression unreadable, but his eyes gentler than she had ever seen. That night, when the fire burned low and the sisters lay safe in the lean-to, Clara sat awake longer. Her hand rested on the Bible Elias's wife had once kept, its cover worn smooth. She traced the edge with her thumb, whispering the verse again, "Overcome evil with good." For the first time since the wagon, hope did not feel fragile, it felt steady.
The ranch carried a rare calm in the days that followed. The threat had ridden off, the judge's word tucked safe in Elias's coat, and the sisters moved about the cabin as if it truly belonged to them now. Ruth swept the porch each morning without being asked. Lydia hummed while feeding the hens, and Clara, though still watchful, worked beside Elias with a new steadiness that carried no edge of suspicion. One evening, the sun fell low over the ridge, staining the sky in copper. Inside the cabin, Ruth and Lydia had already retreated to the side room, their laughter faint through the wall. Clara lingered by the table, drying the last plate while Elias set his rifle aside, freshly oiled and gleaming in the firelight. She turned toward him, her eyes steady. "You meant what you said, didn't you?" Elias looked up, brow furrowed. "About what?" "About us choosing to stay, about this being our home." Her voice did not waver. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I meant it." Silence stretched between them, but it was not heavy. It was full, like the pause before a hymn's next verse. Clara set the plate down and stepped closer. Her hands brushed the table edge, her chin lifted with quiet resolve. "Then I'm choosing," she said. The words hung in the air, simple yet final. Elias rose slowly, deliberate in every movement, as though he understood the weight of what was being offered. He crossed the small space between them until the warmth of the fire mingled with the warmth that passed between their bodies. "You sure?" he asked, his voice low, more solemn than questioning. "I've been sure," she answered, and this time there was no guard in her eyes, only certainty. His hand came up, rough with callus, yet gentle as it brushed her cheek. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into it, her breath catching. When he kissed her, it was slow, steady, the kind of kiss built not from haste, but from trust earned through fire and trial. Clara's hands rested against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She closed her eyes, the weight she had carried since the square loosening at last. For the first time since her father's debts had bound her fate, she felt free, not only by law, but in spirit. When they drew apart, she smiled faintly, unguarded, a softness Elias had never seen from her. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. Elias held her gaze, his own steady. "You don't have to be. Not here." The fire crackled, throwing soft light across the walls. Beyond the door, the cottonwood stirred in the night wind, its leaves whispering like a blessing. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge scraped together after loss. It felt whole, as if the Lord had breathed new life into its timbers. That night, for the first time in years, Elias did not feel alone. And Clara, for the first time since the wagon, felt chosen, by her own will and by grace. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. The first frost lay silver over the grass the morning Elias hitched the mule to the wagon. His breath hung in pale clouds as he tightened the harness, his movements steady, deliberate. He didn't need to speak. The sisters knew what this day meant. Ruth packed bread and coffee into a basket. Lydia carried a jar of beans wrapped in cloth. Clara stood on the porch, her hair tied back with Elias's spare handkerchief, her chin lifted with quiet resolve. The ride into town was long but calm. Lydia pointed out a hawk wheeling above the ridge and a coyote watching from a rise, her voice light, unshadowed by fear. Ruth sat tall on the bench, no longer glancing behind her shoulder as she once had. Clara sat close beside Elias, her hand resting on the bench near his, brushing against his knuckles when the wagon jolted. When they entered the square, the same faces turned, as always, but the looks were different now. Some men smirked still, some spat into the dirt, yet there was no jeering. A few even tipped their hats, grudging acknowledgement in their eyes. Elias guided the mule straight to the clerk's office.
The bell over the door gave its sharp ring, and the clerk looked up as if he had been expecting them. Without a word, he drew a set of papers from a drawer. The judge was waiting in the chamber beyond, a single window throwing pale light across ledgers stacked high. He glanced from Elias to Clara, his lined face unreadable. "I take it this is what you want?" "Yes," Clara answered. Her voice was steady, her eyes fixed. The judge nodded once, dipped his pen, and began to write. The scratch of ink filled the silence, solemn and final. He read the words aloud, then stood as witness while Elias and Clara signed their names. The weight of the moment pressed deep, binding more than paper could. Elias reached into his pocket. The small ring he had bought weeks before rested heavy in his palm. He slid it onto Clara's finger, his voice low but clear. "My wife." Clara looked at him, eyes glistening, and answered without hesitation, "My husband." The words, spoken plain, carried a power that no mutter in the square could undo. When they stepped back outside, the air in the square felt changed. The same men lingered near the saloon and the rail, but something in their faces had shifted. A few nodded. One touched the brim of his hat. Even those who scowled did not speak. The sheriff stood on the porch, arms folded. "That should put an end to it," he said. Elias gave a single nod, his expression unreadable, but his grip on Clara's hand firm. They bought coffee, salt, and a sack of seed before leaving. The wagon rolled out of town under a sky washed clean, the sisters sitting close, Lydia humming as she leaned against Ruth's shoulder. Clara's hand never left Elias's, the ring on her finger catching the sunlight. Back at the ranch, the mule was unhitched and led to water. Ruth carried supplies inside, moving with the rhythm of one who belonged. Lydia ran to the coop to gather eggs, her laughter carrying across the yard. Clara lingered on the porch, her fingers brushing the new band on her hand as if to make sure it was real. When Elias returned from the corral, she stepped to him, resting her palm against his chest. She kissed him slow, steady, not the careful first touch of days before, but the assured bond of covenant. Inside, the fire burned warm. Ruth set bread on the table, Lydia hummed in the next room, and the cabin seemed to breathe with life. Elias held Clara close, listening to the quiet of the place. It was no longer the silence of a man alone, but the sound of a house with roots, sealed not only by law, but by love and by the providence of God. The days after the wedding carried a different rhythm, one the cabin had never known. The air seemed warmer, the silence gentler, no longer the heavy quiet of loneliness, but the hum of a household alive with work, voices, and the steady pulse of belonging. Ruth swept the porch each morning before the sun cleared the ridge, her movements brisk, her face calm. She had taken to humming hymns as she worked, the notes carrying across the yard with a sweetness that made even the hens gather near as if listening. Lydia followed close behind her, scattering feed with a laugh that rang light and unguarded, a sound that had once been unthinkable when fear clung to her every step. Inside, Clara moved with the ease of one who no longer felt like a guest. Her hands stirred pots on the stove, kneaded dough on the table, folded linen with quiet assurance. At times, Elias would catch her looking around the cabin as though memorizing each timber and stone, as if to claim it fully as her own. Elias himself felt the change most sharply in the evenings. Where once he had banked the fire alone, the cabin echoing with nothing but the groan of its beams, now there were voices, soft, steady, weaving through the space. Sometimes Lydia would hum while Ruth stitched by lamplight. Sometimes Clara would sit by the fire, reading from the old Bible that had once belonged to Elias's wife. Her voice, calm and sure, filled the room with a weight both solemn and tender. One night she read from the Gospel of John, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid." John 14:27.
The words lingered in the air long after her voice fell silent, seeping into the walls like a promise. Elias listened, his eyes on the fire. He had spent years carrying silence like a burden, convinced peace was a thing buried with the past. Yet now, hearing those words spoken in the cabin that once felt like a tomb, he felt something stir in him, an easing of a weight he had thought would never lift. The work of the ranch remained unrelenting. Fences needed mending, wood had to be split, grain hauled before the winter deepened. But the labor no longer fell on one pair of shoulders. Clara worked beside Elias in the yard, holding posts steady while he hammered rails, her strength quiet but unwavering. Ruth tended to the chickens. Lydia carried water from the pump, laughing when the cold splashed over her boots. The place no longer looked like a man's solitary struggle against the land. It looked like a home tended by many hands. One evening, as the last light drained from the sky, Elias stood at the rise where his wife's grave lay.
He looked down at the cross, the cedar worn but still standing. For the first time in years, he did not feel the sting of failure pressing against his chest. Instead, he felt something like peace, as though the ground itself had accepted what had been built anew. He tipped his hat, murmured a prayer of thanks, and turned back toward the cabin. Light spilled from the window, golden and warm. He could see Clara moving inside, Ruth setting plates on the table, Lydia skipping across the floor. The sight held him still for a moment. It was ordinary, yet to him it felt like miracle. When he stepped through the door, Clara met him with a quiet smile. She set a hand against his chest, her wedding ring catching the firelight, and said simply, "You're home." And for the first time in years, Elias believed it. Stories like this linger because they remind us of what the old frontier truly carried, not only dust and danger, but also resilience, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of love. Many of you watching have lived long enough to know that life, like the trail, is never easy. Loss leaves its mark, yet faith and kindness still build something that endures.
When we see Elias and Clara choose each other, we remember that even in the harshest times, God plants hope in unlikely places. Perhaps you recall your own beginnings, the long roads you traveled, or the people who stood beside you when the world seemed against you. That is why these true Wild West stories matter. They are not only about the past, but about us, about how courage and grace carry on. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments.